characteristics of our probes will influence energy concentration, how the heat is distributed, and how the chemical reaction is happening inside the tissues. Probe selection also directly affects tissue response, client comfort, and risk of collateral damage. So there's more to probes than just picking one size and then going with that. Even across different brands, across different companies, different types of installations, there's a lot of choices out there. And a good electrologist really understands the science behind the probe choice, especially matching it with the modality choice that you have and then the case on the table. Everything is, one client to the other could be completely different, even if it's two people with chin hairs. So some probe types that we hopefully don't see anymore. So these are some of the probes that were available in the 80s and the 90s. There was really no precise manufacturing process. Think of somebody in their garage with like a little sandpaper, just by hand kind of doing this, applying the metacrylic. This is like a plastic insulation on that. And so under a microscope, you can see all the grooves, right? The grooves inside that metal. Another scary thing is that this was a time when they reused probes quite a bit. So these are all pockets for bacteria, right? We use pre-sterilized, machine manufactured probes for a reason, because in 2026, now, we're more aware of what's out there and hygiene and safety, and we are dealing with tissue, sometimes with, body fluids, with blood. So even if you're classified, and in the US, we are too, even if you're classified more under the aesthetic or beauty technician or therapist umbrella, you should know as a professional that it goes beyond that, right? And you take the steps for that. So also we have different shapes. You can see this one's quite pointy here. It's almost like a pencil tip. And then this one looks a little bit more like a uniprobe, right? They make these types of probes a little bit, but nice and thin there. So different types of manufacturing processes over the years. When we're dealing with probes nowadays, we'll tend to see more of these types of manufactured probes. And there are two subcategories of probes that I start with. You have two-piece filaments and one-piece filaments. I call them probes, I call them filaments, I do not call them needles. Needles are to perforate skin. We don't perforate skin, we go inside a natural opening inside the hair follicle. And so it's a little bit less of a scary term, but also I think it's important to differentiate that we're not actually injecting anything, we're doing an insertion, and so that's probe or filament. So a two-piece probe is a probe that is going to be two separate pieces together. So this is a two-piece probe here, and this is one here. If we look at the one down here, this is the shank, that's the part that goes inside of my probe holder, and this is the filament, and they are two separate pieces. The filament is actually pinched inside the shank, and so the name just kind of says it's just two pieces. If we're dealing with a one-piece filament, we're dealing with a probe where the shank has been shaved down into a point. It is one continuous piece of metal, hence a one-piece probe. So on the market, different brands will have different types. Some brands make both one-piece, two-piece. Some will specialize in one versus the other. You might prefer one type over the other. There are some characteristics to the probes that kind of are important to know. So a two-piece filament is more cylindrical in shape. The diameter of my probe here is exactly the same diameter as my probe here. When we're dealing with a one-piece probe, it's more conical. That means the diameter of my probe here is thicker than the diameter of my probe near the tip. The probe for a two-piece is held inside the shank. The one piece is one continuous piece of metal. Because of its shape with a one piece, the diameter varies slightly, right? So this part here is going to be thicker than this, which is thicker than here, which is thicker than here, because it's shaved down into a point. We use surgical grade probes for ensuring greater flexibility with the two-piece probe. So sometimes the flimsiness of two-piece probes comes from the fact that the diameter of the probe here is just as skinny as the diameter of the probe up here. Whereas this is going to be a stiffer probe because it's thicker down at the base. It slides easily inside the follicle. All probes now kind of have this micro-polished tip. It's not a point because it's not a needle. And so it's actually rounded at the tip, which means that it's not meant to perforate tissue. Now, don't get me wrong, all of us can press hard enough to poke through anything, okay? And then we do it sometimes by accident. But It's not really meant for that. So we talked about it a little bit stiffer, and then when we start bending probes, when you bend a one-piece probe, it's a little bit harder to put it back into a straight position, whereas with a two-piece, it tends to be a little bit easier. You do create a weak point when you bend the probes a lot, so be careful not to snap the probe off. Not so good. Here's another image of what those probes might look like. There's different types of shanks on the market. So when we talk about F, K, and J, I don't see J too much, but I see plenty of Ks and plenty of Fs. So from what I understand, Australian market is all F shank. And when you buy a probe, it says F something. The F refers to the shank, and the shank is this part here that feeds inside your probe holder. If you accidentally buy a box of Ks, the shank is skinnier. And so if you try to put it into your probe holder, it's going to plop right out of it. So I want to make sure that we always buy Fs, right, if that's what it is. Most machines, by the way, manufacturers will make probe holders that fit K-shank probes. There was a complete lack of probes in the US. It was the ProTech probes for a while. They were down a machine and nobody could get their hands on anything. But the K-shanks, they had plenty of those, and so we just bought different probe holders and then ended up buying all the probes in Ks. It doesn't change the filament portion of it, it's just the shank portion. So then we have different types of probes here. These says two-piece, two-piece, two-piece. Here's one piece, one piece, one piece. When we start at the top with probe A, it's a two-piece stainless steel. That means it's a two-piece probe, no installation at all. That's a stainless steel probe. When we go to probe B, it's a two-piece probe with insulation about halfway. ProTech is really the only one that makes this to this point, but I believe that Vale is working on one. So we might see more of these types of probes coming out. So half is covered, half is exposed. This is a two-piece probe that's insulated almost to the tip. Most insulated probes will look like this across companies. Then we have one-piece probe that is stainless steel, one-piece probe that is insulated, and so you can see just the little exposure here at the tip, and then a gold-plated probe. Gold-plated is also non-insulated, by the way. It just has gold plating on it. So surface area and current density. Probe size determines surface area. What I have is I have an image here of what is a cylinder. And then we've started to unravel this cylinder so that you can see what surface area refers to. It refers to the whole outside part of my probe. Can we all understand that the bigger my probe is, the more surface area I'm going to have, right? Small probe, small surface area. Big probe, big surface area, sorry. So the surface area will directly affect current density. The smaller surface area will concentrate the energy more intensely and produce a higher localized heat. These are all thermolysis pulses in egg white. Another thing is this is all the same setting. The only thing that's changed here is the size of the probe. And so what you can see is that with an F1, I have a big coagulation pattern. With my F4, it's barely a blip on the tip of my probe. So choosing the right probe makes a difference, even when you have calibrated your energy. So I can have a setting, pick something that is big, and if it's not calibrated large enough, I'm not going to be producing any sort of tip effect on my probe. Larger surface area will distribute the energy more evenly, so all these electrons can just have room to spread. It's going to be less intense. It also reduces excessive concentration. Sometimes, if you pick too small of a probe and your intensity is really high, you get things called blowouts. When you press on the foot pedal, it goes psh, psh, psh. So that's called a blowout. This really means that you have so much energy concentrated on the tip of my probe that I'm boiling the tissues. We don't want that. Steam does not conduct electricity. So we want to keep it a little more mellow than that. So picking the right size probe is going to be important when it comes to energy distribution. It's not just picking a setting. A smaller probe creates a stronger point effect. Energy is concentrated at the tip when we're dealing with thermolysis. And if you go too small, you actually risk overheating, that blowouts that I was talking about. You can also risk wall perforation. It's going to be easier to poke through tissues with smaller probes just because they're thinner. And surface skin reactions. If you have too much energy, and especially if you're creating steam down here, the energy is going to find somewhere else, especially if you're a multiple tapper. It's going to find somewhere else to exit this probe, and it's going to be higher up on this probe. This insulation, even if it is insulated, it's very, very thin. and current can definitely blow through that insulation if it has nowhere else to go. And so we can end up seeing surface damage, even with insulated probes, when you pick something that's too small where the intensity is too high. Larger probes reduce tip concentration and can improve stability of the current. So this here shows you the point effect in egg white. This is a 2-piece probe, this is a 1-piece probe, and you can see that the probe is in contact with moisture all along this probe here. But the reaction still happens mainly at the tip. Because with thermolysis, the current travels down the probe and then radiates from the tip first. Now, the more time and intensity I have, the bigger this can end up being, but it always originates from the tip first. So the tip jump, so the shape of the coagulation also, it has an effect on that, and the depth of energy concentration. Smaller probes intensify the point effect. So let's play our little video here. So this again is kind of a little thermographic image of a ZAP. At the hottest heat, where it's white, we're at 74.9 degrees Celsius, and at the coolest, it looks like it says 30 maybe, 20? I can't quite read it. And so they're just gonna show you kind of different pulses there. So you can see the tip is going to tend to be the hottest, and then as we go out with the circles, it's getting cooler, 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 cooler as we radiate from the probe itself. So you can see here, hottest heat near the tip, and then it's gonna get a little less hot, little less hot, little less hot as we radiate out from there. So when we're dealing with non-insulated versus insulated probes, what we have here in the image, thermolysis, here's blend. Thermolysis, blend. Non-insulated, insulated. Non-insulated probes release energy along the full length of the probe. There is still a point effect with thermolysis. We saw that in the previous slide. But should there be long enough timing, my current is going to spread up the probe. Longer timing with thermolysis, this is where we can start seeing surface damage if the timing is too long, the intensity is too high. When it comes to galvanic, if we have, this is a non-insulated probe, any part of the probe that is in contact with tissue will produce slide. There is no point effect with galvanic. There is a slightly bigger area down here, and that's because this is blend, and so there's a little bit of high frequency, so there's going to be increased amount of light production right there. But as you can see, there's going to be light produced at the top, just like in the middle, just like at the base. There's no point effect with galvanic. Any area that is going to be inside the egg white simulates our follicle, but anything that is below the skin is fair game. The more moisture there is, the more light it will be producing, but it does produce evenly along the probes. There are some insulated probes that you can use with blend. That's blend, by the way, in galvanic, surface area is important. I do need a large surface area to be able to produce a large amount of blend or light. Otherwise, it might take too long to create the amount of light that I need. So usually people will tend to go for more non-insulated probes when we're doing blend or galvanic. If you do use an insulated probe, it has to be one of those probes where there's a lot of exposure, because I need surface area. But this is showing you what that might look like with an insulated probe. So you can see, sure, the bubbles will kind of move up, but you can see that there's no light production up here. It's preserved down to that bottom half of the probe. This is an insulated probe. It shows you there is no heat really creeping up here, keeping the epidermis safe, and all of the heat is concentrated at the base. So insulated probes restrict the energy release at the exposed tip. That allows us to have lower settings. One of the reasons to go to an insulated probe versus a non-insulated probe, especially with thermolysis, is that it allows you to lower your parameters in general. And it can improve comfort for the client and precision. So you're putting the heat exactly where you need it and nowhere else. So here's another image, thermographic cameras showing you insulated versus non-insulated, and how the heat is concentrated here at the tip, and you can see that there's really no heat produced up here. Slight creeping of the heat is normal. And then a non-insulated probe here, where you have that area is still going to be most concentrated at the tip, but you can see that it definitely creeps up the follicle, making this much more likely to have visible side effects post-treatment on the client. So insulation reduces lateral heat spread, so it doesn't go too far out. You can see how wide this pattern is here compared to this one, and it keeps it away from the epidermis itself. It's particularly beneficial when you're using high frequency thermolysis, when you're treating sensitive or previously treated skin, or you're working at shallow depth to really protect that epidermis. Depth of insertion is gonna be important. So in the top here, this is the same setting, 2 different insertions. But what you're seeing on the left, which is barely a blip on the radar here, is a deep insertion with a non-insulated probe. And then same setting, but shallow insertion with the non-insulated probe. This is where sometimes people will tend to overtreat if you're using non-insulated probes with thermolysis. Well, really with anything, but for the most part, what you're doing here is you have a large surface area here. So the energy will tend to spread a little bit more. So because it spreads, there's less concentration, and you can see that the little teardrop is extremely small. This won't do anything to anyone. When I retract and I'm shallow, I've reduced my surface area. Air does not conduct electricity, so this is like it doesn't exist. And now all of my energy is concentrated on a smaller surface of my probe, and so it will be more intense. If I've calibrated my machine for this depth of insertion, meaning that this is where I go and my heating pattern might end up looking something somewhat like this, and then I retract and I do the telogen hair next to it, I could end up overtreating and possibly scarring the tissues. So we have to be aware of the differences there when we're doing deep versus shallow, especially with non-insulated probes. This goes away when we're dealing with insulated, because our insulation essentially acts as a non-conductor, and so the area that's exposed is always going to be the same so long as it's under the skin. So heating pattern here, about the same. Skin is protected, deep versus shallow insertion. So probe choice for chemical for galvanic. During galvanic, light is produced along the exposed probe surface. And so what you're seeing here, this is, by the way, videos from Dr. Schuster. So he was a dermatologist and an electrologist in the 80s and 90s, did a lot of research on electrology, make these very boring videos, but that being said, they were actually really informative. It's just super monotone. But you're seeing the line, it's pulsing too, so this is actually a blend, it's a pulsing blend. You can kind of see the flash happening and then the follicle kind of, and the tissues kind of retract, that's the heat. But you can see the bubbles being produced, and so it was kind of cool because he did all of these experiments and you can actually visually see what's happening under the skin, which normally we don't see, hopefully. So light is produced along the exposed probe surface. The probe surface will influence the amount of light produced. I want surface area. Don't go concentrated for when you're doing galvanic. You need that spread of energy because remember that any part of that probe is going to start producing the light. Otherwise, it's going to take a lot of time to produce the same amount of light, which could end up being kind of a little bit annoying during the sessions. And then you have also distribution of that chemical destruction, which you need. Excessive insulation will limit light production and confine the chemical action only to the tip, which we really don't want because remember that we want to get structures that are maybe out of reach or even up higher in the follicle. So with thermolysis, smaller surface area equals higher thermal concentration. So don't pick too small for higher settings, it doesn't actually help your case. Insulation will definitely improve control. You can do different depths of insertions during the session without having to mess with the machine too much or change probes too much. So if you do a technique where, especially a client that comes in that had shaved, where I have telogen, anagen, catagen, everything's at different depths of insertion, it gives me that freedom to just be able to move quickly without having to mess too much with my setting. For galvanic, you need greater exposed surface to enhance light production. What you're seeing down here, this is an insulated probe, and so you can see that the light is being produced, but I kind of look at it as like a long queue with a lot of people, like people have to get away before I can go through, and so versus having maybe like this whole door open and everybody moves in at the same time. So it's just impeding how fast I can produce this light, so don't over concentrate your energy. This is an insulated probe for blend, so it just has more exposure. And this is a non-insulated where the whole entire length of the probe can produce the light. Blend is gonna be a balance between thermal concentration and chemical diffusion, so, we'll tend to see with blend, sometimes a slightly bigger point effect, even with the lye, just because we have that thermal action happening there. Probe choice has to align with the mechanism of action. So choose a probe that's appropriate for the modality that you are utilizing. So probe size controls energy intensity. So smaller probes are more intense probes. Larger probes will spread the energy over a bigger surface area. Surface area affects thermal and chemical distribution. Installation directs energy and protects tissue. And many treatment issues are probe sizes, not really setting issues. And I see that a lot at the school, again, because they're too scared to go for bigger probes, because the insertion's easier when the probes are smaller. Okay, so modality and probe, let's try to put a little bit of that together. So why matching matters? So no single modality or probe works best in all situations. This goes back to that question that I see sometimes on social media, which is like, what probe and intensity should I use for a chin hair? Well, there's a lot of different ways to do it. And not only that, but on the same client,